There was a time when the Premier League was distinctly lacking when it came to great defensive midfielders, at least for the first decade of the league's existence, as most managers persisted with a 4-4-2 formation, typically playing one or two all-action box-to-box midfielders rather than classic anchors or number 10s. That began to change in the early to mid-2000s, and now the league is littered with fantastic holding midfielders, whether that be Rodri, Fabinho, or Declan Rice. This is the 5th video in this series, taking a look at the greatest players of the Premier League era in each position, culminating in an all-time Premier League squad and best 11 during the same year that the breakaway league turns 30 years old. All of the videos up to this point, goalkeepers, right-backs, centre-backs and left-backs, have been pretty straightforward. But in midfield, just as when I made an all-time version of this series covering all players from all eras and from all leagues, things start to get a little bit more complicated. Essentially, for the purposes of creating a best 11 at the end of this series, I am only making 2 midfield videos, covering defensive and attacking midfielders. Of course, some midfielders are just central or box-to-box midfielders and are therefore not obviously more attacking or defensive. Others, like Paul Scholes for example, started out as attacking midfielders but ended up playing in a far deeper role. Consequently, I have to try and pigeonhole each player as best as I can, but it isn't an exact science. And no, I wouldn't ordinarily call some of the players in this 7 and in my honourable mentions defensive midfielders. But for the purpose of this series, I think they are more accurately classified as defensive than attacking midfielders, given that they are the only 2 options. I hope that all makes sense, and I apologise for the long-winded introduction, but I didn't want anyone to get confused. Just lastly, a reminder as ever that this series is ranking the greatest players, not just the best, so quality and quantity of performances during the Premier League era are taken into account. Javier Mascherano, for example, is one of the best defensive midfielders that we have seen in the Premier League, as far as I'm concerned. But he didn't even play 100 games in England, whereas someone like Scott Parker, who was less talented, played almost 400 times. You get the idea. Here are the 7 greatest defensive, or not really defensive, but more defensive than attacking on the balance of things, midfielders of the Premier League era. 7th, Jordan Henderson. Jordan Henderson is quite possibly the most underrated Premier League player of all time, and I must admit, it took me far longer than it ought to have done to fully appreciate him. It must be said, Henderson wasn't always as good as he has been in the last few years. I don't think there can be any doubt that his game has come on leaps and bounds since Jurgen Klopp arrived at Anfield in 2015. But objectively, even taking that into account, I think he has to feature in a 7 of this ilk. To begin with, Henderson has played 381 games in the Premier League. That is an enormous number of games, and the Liverpool captain is still only 31 years old, meaning that he could easily have another 100 to 150 top-flight appearances left in the tank. When Jordan Henderson joined Liverpool from Sunderland in 2011, I think a lot of people doubted his ability to make it at Anfield. Indeed, Brendan Rodgers even wanted to sell Henderson to Fulham in a swap deal involving Clint Dempsey in 2012 before Henderson was persuaded otherwise by Stuart Downing. Even by 2015, when Henderson was a regular starter for Liverpool, a lot of people questioned whether he had what it would take to replace Steven Gerrard as the Reds club captain. 6 years later, Henderson has done something that Gerrard couldn't in lifting both the Premier League and the Champions League as Liverpool captain, and he has been integral to both of those successes. A fantastic professional with a brilliant footballing brain, an awful lot of people underestimate Henderson's role in Liverpool's success in recent years. Very rarely wasteful in possession, Henderson has a fantastic engine, and I still think Liverpool look far weaker when he is out of the side. Fun fact, despite only having the 47th most appearances of any player during the Premier League era, Henderson has already made more passes than any other Premier League player. 6th, Fernandinho. We kickstart this 7 with 2 current Premier League midfielders, as Fernandinho comes 1 place ahead of Jordan Henderson. Fernandinho has played far fewer Premier League games than Henderson, 124 fewer to be exact, but every one of them has come at the very highest level. for a Man City team, competing for the league title in virtually every one of those seasons. It is worth noting that Fernandinho was already 28 years old when he arrived in the Premier League, signed by Man City from Shakhtar Donetsk. So it is a measure of his extraordinary longevity within the game that he still makes a 7 of this calibre. I actually think Fernandinho probably played his very best football between 2017 and 2019, so between the ages of 32 and 34. And even now, at the age of 36, he remains utterly brilliant almost whenever he plays. There were times though, particularly during the time frame that I just mentioned, under Pep Guardiola, when I thought a case could be made that Fernandinho was Manchester City's single most important player. They say that tackling in football is a dying art, but it would appear as though Fernandinho didn't get the memo. He is an absolute master at selecting the best possible action in defensive situations, whether that be a neat interception, a fierce slide tackle, or sometimes just a gentle nudging off the ball. His work rate, combined with his reading of the game, gave the sense that he was everywhere at his best, and he was very visibly an absolute nightmare to play against. If you look at Manchester City's points per game with and without Fernandinho during Pep Guardiola's first 3 seasons at the club, the contrast is stark, illustrating his importance. I long felt that replacing him would be Pep's toughest job, but in the form of Rodri, the citizens appear to have another future Premier League great. 5th, N'Golo Kante. N'Golo Kante has by far the fewest Premier League appearances under his belt to date of any player in this 7, so it is a mark of his extraordinary impact during that time that I still felt obliged to include him. Brought to the Premier League by Leicester City, really as a replacement for veteran midfielder Esteban Cambiasso, Kante had big boots to fill, and was relatively unknown in England at the time, having just played his first season of top-flight football in France for Cannes. It didn't take long for everyone in England to know the name N'Golo Kante though, and pretty soon, everyone with any interest in football across the entire world. His performances during his single season at Leicester City, as the Foxes won the most unlikely of Premier League titles, were astounding, both in terms of the amount of ground that he covered, how often he won the ball, and how few mistakes he made. The following season he joined Chelsea, and it was little coincidence that it was Antonio Conte's men who won the Premier League following that signing. Kante has had some injury problems over the last few years, and there have been some disagreements regarding his best position. But he showed yet again in last season's Champions League, as he won the Man of the Match award in both legs of Chelsea's semi-final ties with Real Madrid, and in the final against Man City, that at his best, he is simply one of the most effective players in world football. Only a lack of games and seasons prevented him from making a podium finish in this 7. And if I were to make this video in, say, 2 or 3 years' time, I suspect that he would finish at least 3rd. 4th, Paul Ince. I'll let you in on a little secret. The way in which I make a video in a series like this one, which isn't a wholly original idea, that is to say, I'm not the first person to ponder who are the greatest Premier League players in a certain position, is that I draw up a big shortlist, about 30 players long in the case of today's video. I pick my 7, I order them, and then I take a look at what other people have written and said on the same subject. I do it in that order to make sure that I'm not influenced by other people's views, and so that I don't fall into the wretched trap of groupthink. And I mainly just look to make sure that I haven't been daft and forgotten anyone really obvious, but also out of idle curiosity. Typically, there is plenty of overlap in terms of who features, unsurprisingly, but a number of discrepancies in their order. Rarely is it really shocking, like a list of the Premier League's 10 greatest goalkeepers that doesn't include Peter Schmeichel or Petr Cech and has Aurelio Gomez in top spot. But the exclusion of Paul Ince from virtually every list that I could find, ranking great Premier League midfielders, defensive or otherwise, would seem to be bitterly unfair to me. Ince only very narrowly missed out on my top 3, but I do have a theory as to why he doesn't get anywhere near the credit that he deserves. Ince spent 6 years at Manchester United, half of which he spent as arguably the best midfielder in English football. But his reputation with United fans was badly damaged after he joined Liverpool in 1997. Liverpool fans didn't dislike Ince because of his past, but he only spent 2 seasons at Anfield, having spent far longer and played his best football at Old Trafford. So he isn't really a Liverpool legend, so to speak. So when these discussions about the greatest Premier League midfielders come up, and Liverpool fans passionately make the case for Steven Gerrard, and Manchester United fans for Roy Keane and Paul Scholes and so on, there is no major club supporters with the love of Paul Ince to really make his case. The club where he perhaps retains the most affection, in terms of super clubs at least, if anything might be Inter Milan, who obviously are not relevant to a conversation surrounding the Premier League. Ince played as both a defensive and as a box-to-box midfielder, and given his rock-solid defensive credentials, his output in terms of goals and assists is actually really rather impressive, and among the finest in this seven. A quick, tireless, and powerful runner in midfield, Ince was tenacious in the tackle, economical in his use of the ball, and majestic in transition. Despite playing 7 seasons of first-team football prior to the creation of the Premier League, and spending 2 of his best years at Inter Milan, Ince still managed to make more than 300 Premier League appearances. A 3-time PFA Team of the Year inclusion, who also made the Premier League's Team of the Decade in 2002, if Ince had spent his entire career playing in the Premier League, he would have made at least my top 3. Third, Michael Carrick. Both Michael Carrick and Paul Ince were midfielders who came through the youth ranks at West Ham and played their best football at Manchester United. But the similarities just about end there. Whilst Ince was renowned for his stamina, his running, and his all-action approach, Carrick was a much more relaxed presence on a football pitch. Throughout his entire career, even from youth team level, Carrick was never really the star man in any team that he played in, and he only ever won 34 caps for England. In spite of those facts, he also vastly improved every single team that he ever played in. And it is quite possible that England would have been far better served by giving Carrick greater game time, as the Three Lions persisted with a dysfunctional 2-man midfield. Carrick's arrival at Manchester United from Tottenham in 2006, where he was partnered with a 31-year-old Paul Scholes, saw Alex Ferguson switch up his style of play. Man United drifted away from their fast, aggressive, counter-attacking style of the 1990s and early 2000s towards something a bit more continental and a bit more of a possession-based approach. That may have been a conscious decision that Sir Alex made, but it was also a necessity, given the fact that neither Carrick nor Scholes were physically brilliant, but both read the game brilliantly, were excellent on the ball, and were masters in the pass. Carrick was often overshadowed by Scholes, though there is no shame in that, but his distribution was integral to how Manchester United played. Carrick's touch, awareness, and vision were all world-class for more than a decade, and whilst I do think that there have been 3 better non-attack midfielders in the history of the Premier League at their peaks, I don't think that there are 3 who have been greater. Carrick made 481 Premier League appearances, which is a century more games in the division than any other player in this 7. Second, Patrick Vieira. Whilst Patrick Vieira did, at times, play in defence midfield, particularly as he got a bit older, I would not say he was primarily a defensive midfielder. The Frenchman arrived in the Premier League in 1996 from AC Milan, joining Arsenal under Arsene Wenger. As I described in the introduction, that was a time when the Premier League was heavily populated by midfielders with a bit of everything, who could run for 90 minutes and contribute both defensively and going forward. Vieira fit that mould, and he almost immediately became the very best at performing those functions in the entire division. Quite the sight out on a football pitch, Vieira is 6'4" tall, and about 5 foot of that appeared to be his legs. Though lanky in appearance, Vieira was a fantastic athlete with outstanding technique. His ability to somehow wrap his long legs round a player, cleanly dispossessing them of the ball when they looked to have been in the clear, never ceased to dumbfound his opponents. On the ball, Vieira was extremely intelligent, knowing just when to slow the game down, keep hold of the ball, or run at the opposition. When he chose the latter, in full flow, he presented a pretty terrifying threat. All in all, Vieira's ability to win the ball, keep the ball, and make things happen, whilst being relentlessly driven, consistent, and an outstanding leader, make him one of the Premier League's greatest ever midfielders, and among the finest to have played the game during my lifetime. What's more, he made more than 300 Premier League appearances, 279 of them coming at Arsenal, where he won 3 Premier League titles. Vieira made the PFA Team of the Year 6 times in 9 seasons at Arsenal, a tally which is bettered only by Steven Gerrard during the Premier League era, who spent many more seasons in the division, and Vieira also joined Paul Ince in the Premier League's earliest team of the decade. All things considered, he was nailed on for a spot in my top 2. First, Roy Keane. As with Patrick Vieira, Roy Keane wasn't a classic defensive midfielder. Certainly not during his first decade in the game, but he was often the least attacking player in a central midfield pairing at Manchester United. Throughout most of the 1990s, Keane played in a very similar role to Patrick Vieira, with whom he shared so many famous battles. That is to say, he covered an awful lot of ground, he contributed a great deal in both attack and defence, and he impacted the totality of a game. All of that was made possible by Keane's outstanding stamina and aggression, combined with one of the best first touches in the game and a directness and accuracy about his passing that made him tailor-made for how Sir Alex Ferguson wanted his side to play. In his later years, Keane did start to drop a little bit deeper, as certain physical attributes inevitably began to wane, but there another one of Keane's outstanding attributes was brought even further to the fore: his footballing intelligence. Both on and off the ball, in terms of his positioning and decision-making, Keane was almost flawless, aside from suffering from the occasional rush of blood and doing something a little bit daft. Keane's hot-headedness is often how he is defined these days, particularly by those who never really saw him play. But in reality, whilst his aggression and determination transformed Manchester United into a title-winning machine, Keane was, above all else, just an outstanding footballer. To my mind, he is the greatest midfielder, defensive, central or attacking, of the Premier League era, and arguably the greatest player in any position. Again, that is not to say that he is the best player, though I think a case could be made for him having been the best midfielder, since greatness measures something slightly different. Keane played 366 games in the Premier League, all but 40 of them coming at Manchester United. For more than a decade, he set the standard at Old Trafford as much as Sir Alex Ferguson, both on a match day and particularly in training, and I don't think any other single player has exerted such great influence upon the division. Keane made the PFA Team of the Century in 2007, and I don't think any Premier League era 11 would be complete without having him in it. That is it for my 7, but there are plenty of honourable mentions, some of whom might require some explanation as to why they were left out. Gilberto Silva and Xabi Alonso were perhaps the 2 toughest defensive midfielders to leave out, along with Claude Makelele, all 3 of whom were absolutely sensational throughout their time in English football's top flight. I think all 3 were better players than Michael Carrick, who took 3rd place in my 7, albeit they were all fairly different. But whilst Carrick played 481 games in the Premier League, Gilberto Silva played just 170 games, Claude Makelele 144, and Xabi Alonso 143. Given the strength of the 7 and the criteria of quality and quantity of performances in the division, begrudgingly, I had to leave all 3 out. Current Premier League midfielders such as Fabinho, Rodri and Declan Rice have the potential, I think, to make a 7 of this ilk in the future, particularly the latter 2. But obviously it is just far too early for all 3 in terms of seasons and games played for them to feature. Other candidates on my shortlist who didn't quite make the cut include the likes of Javier Mascherano, Danny Murphy, David Batty, Darren Fletcher, Nemanja Matic, Michael Essien, Gary Speed, Nicky Butt, Emmanuel Petit, Gareth Barry, Lee Bowyer, Tim Sherwood, Scott Parker and George Boateng. A special mention for Michael Essien, who I think, without injuries, would have become an all-time Premier League great midfielder. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video, I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens to make sure that you keep up to track with this series, as well as all of the other marvellous videos that go up on this channel. You can also find me on social media, on either Twitter or Instagram by the username at HITC Sevens on both, or both if you would like to follow me on both. I'm not very active on Instagram, but maybe that'll change at some point. That's all from me, folks. Have a bloody brilliant day.